Well, welcome everybody to Wesley's Own Words, a podcast of the United Methodist Church of Johnstown, brought to you by them and by me, Jeremy Scott. I'm your host and resident Wesley nerd. Just an announcement as we get started today. My book is out, Awakened Words. John Wesley's Wisdom in a Modern Voice. Everything we have covered in this podcast is available in that book, and it is a collection of Wesley's own writings that has been modernized and in a much more readable form. So if you've been following this podcast or are going back and listening to it, you know we've been reading, in the beginning, we were reading Wesley's original writings, which are wonderful and somewhat problematic just because of when they were written, so we've switched to doing an updated version in modern or more modern English, and I'm excited to share that with you. So take a look at it. All right. So today we are beginning a new writing, and we are getting into Wesley's sermons now. So Wesley was interesting for a lot of reasons, and Wesley is the founder of the Methodist movement, gave us a lot. Wesley didn't have a lot of disagreements with the church in his day over things like doctrine or theology, right? He had very practical concerns about the church, how it was living out its mission or wasn't living out its mission, in his opinion, who was getting to participate, who was being excluded from participating, the level of seriousness people were having towards their faith. That was really his concern. He was concerned about the actual practice of faith, the practice of religion, not so much about doctrine and theology. And what that means is we don't have a lot of writings from Wesley that are purely on doctrine or theology or, basically Christian thought. He was pretty much in line with the church and the thinkers of his time. So this differentiates him from John Calvin or Martin Luther or a lot of the other kind of thinkers of his day or before him, because they were really, they had, more of those kind of like theological doctrinal concerns, and that's where they were providing something that was different than kind of the mainstream church of their time. So you'll have a lot of, writings about doctrine and theology and all that kind of stuff from those folks. Wesley, we don't have as much of that. So where we find it and where we find him diving into kind of more, doctrine or theological topics is in his sermons and in his other writings. Now, Wesley's sermons we have a lot of them. And he no doubt preached, a similar sermon. He wasn't a parish pastor, right? He wasn't preaching to the same audience every week, right? So he no doubt had, like what politicians would call like stump speeches, right? He had sermons that he repeated and worked on and presented to multiple audiences. And once one reached a certain level of refinement, of thoughtfulness, he would write it down. And then we would start to see printed versions of Wesley's sermons, because there was no live streaming, there was no YouTube, there was no podcasts, right? So it's not like people were, making audio recordings of his sermons, because there was literally nothing to record audio with. There wasn't records, there wasn't anything. So if you wanted to hear Wesley and hear his thoughts, you actually had to go and listen to him live, and either take notes or whatever, or you needed to get a hold of one of the written forms. And that's what we're going to look at. And so these are Wesley's sermons for sure. That does not mean that he actually read them aloud, exactly verbatim as they're written down on the piece of paper, but they still contain his same essential thoughts and, what he was trying to communicate. So we would get printed versions of his sermons that then, frankly, as Methodism grew, and there'd be other clergy and other pastors or other preachers along the way that people would take from. And it wouldn't be unheard of for later pastors to preach a sermon that was based on or almost directly taken from one of Wesley's. Safe thing to do. Obviously, if you're a Methodist, if you can quote Wesley, you're probably on good footing. So we're going to start with an early one of his that turns out to be very, very influential, called The Almost Christian. Now, the Almost Christian is from 1741, which means that it actually comes after, the United Societies, as he would say, and after, right around the same time that he's writing the General Rules, which we talked about on this podcast. Before he wrote Advice to People Called Methodists, that would be a few years later. So at this point, he hasn't embraced the name Methodist yet in the same way, and Methodism is still a nascent movement, right? There is starting to be class meetings organized. People are starting to become a thing unto itself, but it's not there yet as a fully formed movement. So Wesley is doing a lot of guest preaching. He's moving between churches and churches, starting to do some field preaching. Being out in the highways and the byways with everybody else, and things like that. And that's where but this one of his early sermons. Now, despite what I said at the beginning, there's not a lot of doctrine or theology in this. This is a very practical one of his sermons. And he's basically talking about, what does it mean to be fully a Christian? Because that, again, is his complaint, right? He looks around at his church in his day and says, these folks, we've got a lot of folks running around who, really are only almost Christians. And that's not unexpected. I mean, the church is full of people who are not yet perfect. That's not necessarily unexpected. But his concern is that, they're also not even trying, right? So he's trying to set a standard for what it is, and to be a full Christian in his understanding of what that means, by first talking about what it means is to be almost a Christian. And he's going to go through several kind of categories where he's talking about various things. He's saying, things people may do, outward signs they may show, that are not necessarily bad. Being an almost Christian isn't bad. It's a necessary step to being a full Christian. So it's not a bad thing necessarily to be an almost Christian, but it's not sufficient, right? So this is a whole sermon about things that are good, but not in and of themselves sufficient to call yourself a full Christian. So he starts off by quoting one very small verse in the book of Acts. Wesley will do this. He'll usually frame his sermons around a single scripture verse, not an entire passage. We tend to, in modern church world, tend to read, several verses, full passages from the Bible. I know that's my practice when I preach. He tends to frame it around a single verse, but then he'll bring in additional verses later. So we will see that. So he starts off by quoting Acts 26:28, and it says, "You almost persuade me to be a Christian." So somebody is talking to somebody, and they are saying, "You almost persuade me to be a Christian," meaning they're almost a Christian. Now, one thing, if we're in late Acts 26, then chances are we're talking about Paul here, like the person, probably not the one talking, but the one being talked to, because by the time you get into the later chapters of Acts, it's basically all about Paul. So he quotes Acts 26, "You almost persuade me to be a Christian." And then Wesley goes on to say, "Many people go this far," the almost Christian phase. "Ever since Christianity began, there have been countless individuals in every time and place who have been almost persuaded to become Christians. But since it means nothing to God to only go part of the way, it's crucial to consider, first, what does it mean to be almost a Christian? And second, what does it mean to be a Christian completely?" So he's setting up here. Here's the task of the sermon. Here's what we're going to talk about. Wesley's really good at staying focused. He doesn't tend to meander all that much. So if he's basically saying, this is what this is going to be about. First, what does it mean to be almost Christian? And second, what does it mean to go further to be a Christian completely? Because that's what God wants, right? God wants complete, full people, complete, full Christians. And again, yes, this text is modernized, but there's a certain point in which you can't escape the fact that it's the 18th century. So, some of this is stark, right? I'm not sure I would say that it means nothing to God to go part way. I think God actually really appreciates our efforts, even if they are imperfect or incomplete. This is one of those places where I'm not sure I would agree with Wesley here. Wesley, I think, is being a bit hyperbolic I think God is there cheering us along the way. And actually, he'll say things later on that, lead you to understand that too. But he also has to capture attention, right? He's got to capture people's attention and give them a reason to keep listening, especially if you're preaching on the fields or in the, in the town square. People can wander off. Like if they're not interested and they're not excited by what it is they think they're going to hear, then they're not sticking around. They're going to wander away. So, what does it mean to be a Christian? All right. He starts, being almost a Christian implies, first, basic integrity. I assume everyone agrees with this, especially since by quote-unquote basic integrity, I mean the kind of honesty that wasn't just recommended by the classical philosophers, but expected among everyday people and often practiced by them. According to these principles, people should be just, not stealing from their neighbors through robbery or theft, not oppressing the poor or using extortion, not cheating or deceiving anyone in business dealings, not depriving anyone of their rights, and, if possible, avoiding debt. So he starts off by saying, I'm not talking about basic integrity as this theoretical concept debated by the classic philosophers, right? He's just saying there's a level of being just kind of a decent person, like a good guy, that we all kind of agree, to some degree or another, is true, and that it kind of spans time and location, that if you want to say somebody's operating with basic integrity, they are probably not acting unjustly. They're probably not stealing from their neighbors. They're probably not oppressing people or exhorting people or cheating people, right? I mean, throughout history, we have understood, these are kind of basic morals, basic ethics that human beings have held to from the beginning. Right. So he's basically saying that there's a level of basic integrity you have to have. So if you want to claim any kind of Christian status, like if you want to claim any kind of attempt to be following the ways of Christ, any of this is, even an almost Christian, you first and foremost can't be stealing from your neighbors, right? Like at a minimum, you can't do that. And I think we'd all nod along today in the same way that Wesley is assuming that people will nod along with that and go, well, yes, of course. So basically, he's not even yet talking about, by the way, being a good person. He's basically not being a bad person, right? I mean, it's a little black and white, I suppose. We say basically don't be a jerk, right? First and foremost, don't be a jerk. Don't be taking advantage of people. Don't be, prioritizing yourself, over your neighbors, right? I mean, that's just not, be honest in your business dealings, be trustworthy, right? Like you would expect not only just a Christian to do that, but just a decent person, a good person to do that. And, if somebody isn't even doing that, then, there's probably not a reason to read forward. So basic integrity. Then he goes on to say, furthermore, basic integrity included respecting truth as well as justice. So people despised not only those who swore falsely, calling upon God to witness a lie, but also those known to slander or falsely accuse others. They viewed deliberate liars of any kind as little better, considering them disgrace to humanity and a menace to society, right? So, don't make false promises, don't make false assertions, don't slander or speak ill of other people, don't be a deliberate liar, misrepresenting, the truth to yourself or others, right? That a person with basic integrity doesn't do these things, okay? And once again, we have Wesley starting off with the don't do's. Right. And so general rules have not really been, he might be working on it, but it hasn't been published quite yet, which, of course, if you remember our conversation on the general rules, starts with the don't, like first do no harm, first stop making it worse. The first thing you do is stop hurting yourself and others. It's like, stop making the hole deeper before you try to climb out. So he starts with the don'ts, like you will abstain from things that do harm to yourself or others and cause you to act in a way that is, lacking in basic integrity, as he says. And I like that level. All right, then he continues on. Moreover, a certain degree of love and support was expected among people. So again, we are talking about kind of people in their primitive state, right? Just the basics, human beings being good human beings, across, time and location. Love and support expected amongst people. They expect people to help each other as long as it doesn't harm themselves. This extended beyond simple acts of kindness that cost nothing. It included feeding the hungry if they had extra food, clothing the naked with spare clothes, and generally giving those to those in need whatever they don't require themselves. This is at a minimum but was basic integrity looked like the first component of being almost a Christian, right? It's just fundamental, right? He's like, these are just fundamental. Like, we're not going to have any conversation beyond this if you don't make these fundamental standards of, not lying, not cheating, not stealing, and being, generous. And if you look at how he nuances it here, he's like, giving of your extra clothing, giving of your extra food. So basically, like, if you're not even generous when it is easy to be generous, right? When you yourself have more than you need and you see somebody who has not enough, if you can't be generous in that situation when it's basically going to cost you nothing, right? Are you going to miss, when you can't even be generous with something you probably aren't even going to miss if you don't have it, then you don't have the basic integrity that Wesley is saying. And so, like, that is sort of the minimum standard. And we would all go, yeah, that's how you should act. And of course, that is true. Like, we would all agree, like, that's true. But then because it's in this not almost Christian section that he's dealing with in the beginning of the sermon, he's also saying that's not sufficient, right? Being just simply, acting with basic integrity is important and it is required, but it is not sufficient unto itself. So that's kind of the first category of the categories he's going to talk to. First, have basic integrity. A second aspect of being almost a Christian is having an outward appearance of godliness, following the ethical guidelines prescribed in the gospel, having the external characteristics of a true Christian, right? So being almost Christian involves looking like one to others. So the almost Christian avoids anything the gospel forbids. They don't misuse God's name. They bless instead of curse. They don't make vows at all, simply letting their yes be yes and their no be no. These are all quotes from Scripture, by the way, or paraphrases. They don't ignore the Lord's day or allow it to be ignored even by visitors. They avoid not only adultery, fornication, and sexual impurity, but also any word or look that could lead to these things. All right. They abstain from all idle words, including gossip, backbiting, and coarse joking, and in short, from any conversation that isn't helpful for building others up. Conversations that would grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom they were sealed for their day of redemption. Okay, so these are all mostly from Sermon on the Mount, Matthew, from Jesus' teaching in the Gospel of Matthew, but also, a few other places sprinkled in there. But he's saying they are giving the world the outward appearance. So again, these are all things that are, how you do, how you interact. All these things involve interacting with other people. How do you interact with other people? So you are, if you have the outward appearance of godliness, as he says, that means that you are putting time and energy into looking like you to the rest of the world, that you understand God's teachings, you understand Jesus' teachings, you understand God's expectations, and that you are trying to present to the world that you are attempting to follow those, right? But the important thing here is it's the outward expression of it. This is going to become much important later. We're not going to get there today, but you can kind of start to predict where this may be going for John. But you should have that outward expression, right? That you should, be attempting to, live in the world in a way that people would see you living in this way, right? And again, this isn't necessary. He's not saying this is a bad thing with lumping it in the almost a Christian category, right? Like, people should look at your life and go, oh, okay, he seems to, he or she seems to, kind of have it together, kind of be trying to do the right thing, right? They're not, participating in, in inappropriate behavior, inappropriate conversations, they're not, saying things falsely that they're not actually going to do, that kind of thing. So they are working on, being, acting in that way, building each other up, not doing things that, God would probably prefer we not do, right? But on the outside, it appears as if that is true, that's what people are doing, and we are supposed to do that. And so John says, do that. I'm like, okay. They avoid drunkenness, wild parties, and gluttony. They avoid as much as possible all conflict and contention, continually striving to live peacefully with everyone. If wronged, they do not seek revenge or retaliate. They don't insult, quarrel, or mock others, whether for their flaws or weaknesses. They don't intentionally harm or upset anyone. In all their actions and words, they follow the simple rule: do unto others what you would have them do unto you. Again, things that we all agree, I would think, that is the way we ought to behave in the world. And we are called to behave in that way. And we should do that. But to the outside world, there's an appearance of us trying to do that. So again, we're in this outward appearance. All right. And then he keeps going. And then it gets, so we go, okay, that all makes sense. Avoid, again, we're in the avoiding things, right? So we don't, more don't do's. Don't go to wild parties. Don't be drunk. Don't, involve yourself in adultery or fornication, coarse joking or gossiping, right? And so you abstain from these things. And a lot of this being commonly practiced, right? I mean, then as now. I mean, you will find people, this is common practice in a lot of places. And so you're going to, people, who are almost Christians may stand out for choosing not to participate in things that everyone else is participating in. And so we've got that. And then he says, and in doing good. Oh, okay, not just, we're back to good. So we've got one cycle of don't do's and then do-do's. And then, and now we've had another cycle of don't do's, and now we're getting to the things we're supposed to do. And in doing good, they don't limit themselves to simple acts of kindness. They work hard and even endure hardship to benefit others. So not just the things that are easy to do. Not just basic integrity is being generous when it is easy to be generous. Having the outward appearance of godliness means being generous even when it's hard, right? Blessing others even when it's not the easiest thing to do. Working hard, even enduring hardship to benefit others. Seeking to help in any way they can, despite fatigue or discomfort. Whatever their hand finds to do, they will do it with all of their might. Whether for friends or enemies, good or evil, they are not lazy in any endeavor. As they have opportunity, they do good in every way possible to all people, attending their spiritual as well as physical needs. Okay, well, this it's getting harder, right? It's getting the expectations are going up. We might be nodding along, yeah, of course. Of course. Wait a minute, what? Doing good to others, even when it's hard, difficult, is going to cost me something? Okay, yes, I see where that's part of being a Christian, but really that's still only almost a Christian? They correct the wicked, instruct the ignorant, strengthen the wavering, encourage the good, and comfort the suffering. They strive to awaken those who are spiritually asleep, to lead those whom God has already awakened to the fountain opened to cleanse them from sin and impurity, and to encourage those saved through faith to live in a way that reflects well on the gospel of Christ. We are now in that territory where, I will say as a pastor, if I looked out at my congregation and was able to think to myself with reasonable amount of certainty that, everyone I was looking on was doing this, right? Was willing to do this much, was willing to not be lazy and endeavor for others and do good, to strengthen the wavering and encourage the good and comfort the suffering, right? In a proactive way, right? Now we're into not just simply reacting, we are in a proactive. You should, I'm looking for opportunities, even if they cost me something, even if they're hard. I'm going to go and do it anyway. Man, if I could look out on my congregation on Sunday morning and be able to say and think to myself, man, everybody out there is really trying their hardest to live up to this and do what Wesley says. I would feel great about that. And in fact, I do. I mean, to be fair, in my particular church, I'm in a great place. I got great people. I think to some degree, this is how a lot of folks live. And I would look out and say, man, you're doing a good job, right? And I think in a way, Wesley's saying that too, right? But I would say, you're doing a great job. Absolutely, you should do that. And, the world would certainly be a better place if more people did things like that in a proactive way. you know. But again, this is still, he's talking about the outward, look of holiness, because these are all still things that someone can look at your life and how you look and see that you do these things. I can see that you're working hard. I can see that you're loving people. I can see that you're blessing people. I can see that you're striving to awaken those who are spiritually asleep, right? Like, these are all signs that I can look at your life and see, yes, you are doing those things. And I would be honest, like, man, I would be beaming, if I looked into people's lives and saw that they were doing these things, and I would be so affirming of them for doing so. And so I don't want to take that away, and I don't want to, and I think in many ways Wesley would have done that as well. But we also can't exceed the fact that we're in the almost a Christian, right? So yes, we have to have these outward signs. We've got to struggle. We've got to be willing to do hard stuff, and it's still not sufficient. Okay. He goes on. The sermons move faster, by the way, and I probably should have said this from the beginning. The sermons, the text is not as dense as it is in his little pamphlet style writings, which is mostly what we've been reading with the general rules and the advice, because those are meant to be dense and they're meant to be, printed shortly. This, again, is a sermon. In a sermon, you can use more words and take longer. But for what we're doing here, trying to pull the wisdom out of it, you also get through more of it because it is not as densely packed, and that's okay. But we're going to get through much bigger chunks of text now that we're in the sermons than when we got through before, just so you know. All right, paragraph 7. Those who have the outward form of godliness also utilize the means of grace. Means of grace is what Wesley's understanding of the things that we can do that allow us to, confidently or, with some certainty access the grace God has for us. Engaging in all of them whenever possible, they regularly attend church, but not like those who come into God's presence adorned with excessive jewelry and expensive clothing or with gaudy or vain attire, right? So you want to have the outward appearance of holiness, you attend church. But even attending a church isn't enough. Because if you're coming for seen and be seen, if you're coming to show off, if you're coming to show like how expensive your house or your car or your jewelry or your clothing is, or to, because you think it's where the important people hang out, so you want to be an important person, so you're coming to church to show off and peacock around or whatever, then you're not even in the almost category, basically. He's like, you don't even qualify as almost at that point. You are just, and Jesus says basically the same thing, right? Like, those who flout their generosity have received all the blessing they're going to get, by just, being so over the top or, showy in what it is they do. So these people, through their inappropriate socializing or frivolous behavior, demonstrate that they lack both the form and the power of godliness, right? They're not even trying. I wish we didn't have some among us who were guilty of the same. Oh, even amongst the Methodists, there are some people there for inappropriate or sad reasons. Ooh, interesting. They may enter the church looking around distractedly or with signs of listless indifference, even though they may briefly pray for God's blessing on what they are about to do. During the worship, they may fall asleep, recline in a comfortable position, or as if God were asleep, chat with each other, or look around as if they have nothing to do. I'm not going to say I've never had somebody fall asleep in church. I have. I think most places will kind of have a little bit more decorum than this. But, if you're there just to socialize, if you're there just to, catch some Z's, if you're there just to, do something other than worship God, then again, you're not even almost a Christian. No, someone with even the outward appearance of godliness behaves with seriousness and attentiveness throughout the service, especially when approaching the Lord's table. They do not act carelessly or flippantly, but with a demeanor that expresses nothing but, God, have mercy on me, a sinner, right? So even within those who attend church, right, it matters not just that you attend, it matters where your heart is and what you were doing while you are there, right? Simply being in the building, you're not going to, access and have experiences of God's grace simply by being in the building and breathing the air. It's not going to happen by osmosis. That's not how it works. You actually have to, participate in the act of worship, and you have to participate, honestly, and you have to participate with your heart, and you've got to actually go and do, not in a go through the motions kind of way, but you got to go and do in the way that, is honest. But, even then, still not sufficient. And then the last we're going to read today is, in addition to this, if those who lead households regularly hold family prayers and set aside time for private prayers, displaying consistent seriousness in their daily lives, then they have the outward form of godliness. Only one thing more is needed for them to be almost a Christian. They need one more thing, and they're still only almost a Christian: sincerity. Now, we'll talk about sincerity next time. But Wesley's got some real provocative things here, if you really think about, everything that's being, said and shared, in this particular one. He's laying a pretty, and basically he's setting a really, really high standards. And this really is quintessential young Wesley, right? I mean, so we're young. Wesley's young in years. This is young in the Methodist movement. He's got that kind of, vigor that comes from youth. He's got that kind of seriousness within his faith. And you'll see this in Wesley's journals at the time as well. Ooh, sorry, yawn. As where he is actually very hard on himself. Right. And so this is a time that he is actually being very hard even on himself. So he's not sparing himself from this. I mean, and in many ways, he's doing what a lot of preachers doing, which is he's preaching to himself. Right. He will write about in his journals where he is guilty of all these things, of going through the motions or having the outward appearance of Christianity, outward appearance of godliness without necessarily feeling like he is completely there. As Wesley ages and matures, we get into, especially later in his life, he'll live a good long life. So we get later in his life, actually several decades from this, but, he will have more grace for himself and others. He will be a little less stark. There is a little bit in here, I have to be honest, of the arrogance that comes with youth on Wesley's half, right? And you can read this as Wesley not valuing these outward signs and outward expressions all that much by lumping them into this almost Christian category. He would get much more nuanced and subscribe more value to this process later than he has right now. Hold on. Sorry, man. I'm not even that tired this morning. What's going on? Sorry about that, audience at home. So I think that's important for us to consider, right? All right. And so he has this level of starkness to it that would not, continue forever, for him. And yet, I mean, this was a message that resonated with people, right? Because people would have saw the group of people he's talking about and reaching, the working class, the working poor, those who are kept on the outside, those who feel a little bit shunned, by society and what's going on around them, right? They would, and struggle with their place in it. When they are hearing this message, they are thinking of people in their minds, and they are not thinking of themselves. Right. But they are thinking about the important people, the privileged people, all that kind of stuff. And so when Wesley says, even these people that you have been told to look up to, these people you've been held up as an example, right? And who hold themselves up as, prim and proper, right? These are British people, like, let's be honest, right? So as prim and proper and correct, right? Those folks, right, are, still are not, that alone is not sufficient even for them. So, this will become, even though right now it feels a bit stark and a bit judgy, like the standards are already incredibly high, and we haven't even gotten to what it is to be a real Christian yet, that these standards are incredibly high and unachievably high, right? That yes, that's a thing, and yet that is a message that's still going to resonate with people. It's still going to become an inspiring message as we continue when we get to what it is to be an actual, real Christian. And I think that's important. And I think, that's why it's always important to read the whole thing. So we will continue on next time reading more. But we also kind of get ways back to he's setting the bar high. And he's doing it intentionally, and he's doing it purposefully. And he is, in some ways, calling out those for whom they would this is where they would hang their hat, right? Those whom, would say, but wait, I go to church and I'm here for the right blah, I do this, that, other stuff. And understanding that most of those people in Wesley's day were the wealthy, the people with means, the people with status in their society, the people of the higher classes, right? That's who he's describing here. And he's doing it all in this way that's still lumping them in the almost category. So in many, will end up being actually an inspiring and affirming thing for those who don't. So yeah. I think this is really, I really appreciate, early Wesley, young Wesley, in this regard, just because you can see kind of the fire in him and the, and the kind of, very kind of, I don't want to say black and white, but it's a little black and white, some black and white thinking, and the incredibly high standards he's setting for himself, and for this thing called Methodism that is growing up around him. One of the things that's distinct about Wesley from the beginning was that why they were called Methodists in the first place, because they had a methodical approach to their faith that was not common at the time. And again, Wesley's not letting his own self off the hook here, right? There are readings from his journals and other places at the time where you realize he's beating even up on himself for being only an almost Christian. And over time, with time and energy, he would soften on that. But for now, this is where he is. And this becomes one of those kind of, seminal writings, seminal sermons in the beginning of Methodism that is something and is providing ideas that people are going to gather around and help us figure out who we are. So, all right. Well, we will continue on next time together. Again, you can find the downloads on our website, johnstown.church. Or I think I usually post them in the description as well. You can find the downloads there if you want to read the original text. You can find it there. You can also pick up a copy of Wesley Awakened Words, Wesley's Wisdom in a Modern Language, or what did I call it? Whatever, something like that. Awakened Words. You'll find it. It's on Amazon. And if you want to follow along doing that as well. So, all right. Well, thank you for joining me. Thank you for being a part of this. I do love doing this. I'm glad to be back doing it. And we took a couple weeks off there, but we are back in it. And we will continue on with this next time. And until I see you again, have a blessed day.